Is it dead or alive? Human or inhuman?
To prey upon the innocence of children.
The awful, creeping, crawling terror.
And there Satan gratifies his unspeakable secret desires.
Hi, my name is Mike Snow, and in some ways the history of cinema is the history of horror. Film first became a medium of artistic expression around the time when Dracula itself was published in the late 1800s. It was a time period when Gothic horror sort of reached its apotheosis from its beginnings in the Romantic era at the beginning of the century. And in some ways it perfected what people thought of as the tone and the mood and the atmosphere of what we were watching, because more than any other art form, film, I think, is really about the mood and the setting around you, because you can create that sense of a dream or a nightmare. And so it's not surprising that amongst some of the great dramas and war movies and science fiction films, that there's a heck of a lot of horror in the first 30 or 40 years of film from around 1890 to 1930, roughly speaking. Some of the greatest films of that era were either silent films or early talkies that explored the dark inner nightmares that were plaguing the conscience or the psyche of the Western world at the time. Oh, come on, I mean, old-fashioned horror movies, silent films can't actually be terrifying, can they? Okay, I take back everything. Silent movies can be scary. They can be really, really terrifying. Ugh, that horrible pit. Oh, the tongue. Why does it have a tongue? Oh, God. Well, obviously, most movies made back then, especially in the silent era, are not going to be as terrifying as a modern film that can really convince you to feel terror when you see something. The silent era produced a lot of definite, great horror movies that are still worth watching today, and I think still have aspects about them that are scary and terrifying, especially in a psychological sense. And even if you're not actually scared by them, they may still produce a sense of fear and worry, even after almost a century has passed since they came out. Some silent films just don't really feel like real entertainment over a century later somehow, but for some reason or another, the horror films, above all others, have retained their sense to scare and to be terrifying, whereas some of the other dramas or romantic films or comedies are really difficult to sustain or appreciate in anything other than an intellectual way. So that's why I'm going to give a brief overview of some of the best early horror films from this time period. The first one we're going to talk about is The Cabinet of Dr. Caligari, which I think stands out as the absolute best of the silent film era's horror output. I mean, this is a masterpiece. It is about a group of men in a strange town somewhere in Central Europe who discover a sleepwalker named Cesar. And Cesar is controlled by this mysterious carnival barker type figure named Caligari. And inside Caligari's cabinet, Cesar is kept, where he's let out to make vague fortune-teller-like pronouncements. Eventually, it's discovered that Cesar is being made as a sleepwalker to wander out as a murderous somnambulist and attack and kill people. For what reason? Who knows? Is Caligari directing it? He certainly seems to be. And the world that they've created here in Caligari, the great thing about it is that you don't really know exactly what's happening. It can be interpreted in a variety of different ways. Why is this strange sleepwalker being sent out to murder people? Is it his desire? Is it Caligari's desire? Why does he want these people dead? This movie was created in the aftermath of the First World War, and to quote Joe Bob Briggs, the movie critic, in his amazing book Profoundly Disturbing, World War I created the modern horror film. That war was a nasty, relentless, mind-numbing slaughter, churning out maimed and mangled bodies that, thanks to modern medicine, were sent home to their communities instead of being buried on the battlefield as they would have in past wars. Many soldiers were treated for insanity for the rest of their lives. He also goes on to say that Cabinet of Dr. Caligari is the first psychological horror film. Always probably the best type of horror film, where people can become terrified not because of an animalistic instinct that something is going to kill them, like a vampire. They're horrified at the fact that the world has become unstuck in unreality. We don't know what is going on around us. The film was made with amazing Dutch angles. The cinematographer made the camera turn at weird directions, so everything seems sort of diagonal in a way. The backgrounds are amazing painted works that look like some sort of Grand Guignol, perhaps Guignol mixed with surrealism, that help to create the mind-numbing terror of a nightmare, that you know something is going on, and you're maybe just, as you are in a dream, an actor. We follow a script when we're in a dream. We obey, we know that we're a character, and we do something in this dream because we know somehow the script of the dream, and we obey it. We don't make conscious decisions in our dreams. In a way, the film was written by two pacifists who had both served in the First World War. And they decided to make Caligari, this puppet master of the murderer Caesar, into a symbol for totalitarian control. Although because Hitler was barely known at the time, this was really more about Kaiser Wilhelm rather than the later Nazis. Of course, with retrospect, it looks very similar to how we would interpret totalitarianism under especially Hitler, but also Stalin or any other tyrant of the 20th century. Hitler himself, bizarrely enough, actually referred to himself on numerous occasions as moving with the sureness of a sleepwalker. So even the leader of the Third Reich was someone that was using these weird somnambulist analogies to refer to his own behavior. And in some ways that's a sort of myth about how people behaved during the 30s and 40s. They were simply guided on by some sort of evil puppet master. They lost their ability for rational thought and suddenly became the pawn of some other outside control that forced them to do unspeakably evil things. By the end of the movie, we don't really know exactly what happened, because it seems that this story might be related by an insane person to someone who was a director of an insane asylum who was played by Caligari himself. It's an amazing work because it can be analyzed and looked at in a variety of ways. It still retains, even in 2018, the intense dream or nightmare-like atmosphere that is at the heart of filmmaking, I think, that you can create living dreams in front of you. And the fact that it retains that and its ability to shock and terrify is amazing, and the political ramifications of it are still meaningful today. This is an extraordinary work, and it's highly recommended that anybody see it if you're interested at all in horror movies. Das Vampyr by the Danish director Carl Theodor Dreyer. This is one of the greatest horror films ever made, and is one of the most perfect examples of the capturing of a dream on the cinema screen. Some of my favorite directors, like Werner Herzog and David Lynch, deliberately make movies in a very dreamlike fashion. They have this sort of sense of unreality and the sort of airy gliding away into the subconscious that is perfectly encapsulated in this magnificent film from the early 30s. It is technically a retelling of the Sheridan Le Fanu novel Carmilla. However, it really is a very loose adaptation, and that was really only used as sort of a stepping stone for the later section of the story. Most of the time it involves a young man who goes to a mysterious house where he believes some sort of strange creature is out to harm him or the people there. Everything has the aspect of a dream. People do not behave normally. They can barely seem to understand what's going on in the world around them, and they behave almost like sleepwalkers. In one of the first sections of this movie, we see a man with a scythe called a reaper in the script. And he's mowing some hay, and they try to get his attention, but they can't. He's just in his own world, in his mind. Almost every one of these characters is sunk inside their own dreamscape, in a way. As we progress through the story through one surreal set piece to another, we try to figure out what's going on, but we just have to sort of let it wash over us. We can't really analyze it. It has to be an experience that we feel as we go by, as the character begins to suspect more and more that there may be a vampire at work in this strange country house. It was filmed as the first sound movie of Dreyer's. However, it really doesn't feel like a sound movie because there's barely any sound at all. And what is there is very primitive, old-fashioned sound that doesn't feel like normal speech. It seems like some sort of bizarre, barely audible utterance from the depths of your own mind that you can barely make out. There are amazing segments in this story that seem to prefigure another great film, Heart of Glass, where he hypnotized the entire cast, and in order to make them sort of walk through in this sleepwalker state, again, a little bit like Caligari. And this movie, according to the script, there's very little dialogue in it. There's more just descriptions of what the characters are doing or what they want the characters to do. According to one scene, which I'm going to read here, Nicholas is lying on the ground as when he last saw him. He begins to return to consciousness. The dream he has just had enters his semi-consciousness. He opens his eyes a fraction as if drowned in sleep, and sees the procession of his dream, at first making straight for him but presently turning away. He turns to watch it and discovers that he is lying on the ground outside the churchyard. The funeral procession is making for the churchyard. Suddenly he is awake and the dream disappears. The strange procession literally vanishes into empty air. He asks himself whether the whole of this dream may not be a message from Giselle, and if so, what she is trying to tell him. He gets up and goes out to the entrance to the churchyard. Probably the most famous scene in this movie is when we see from the perspective of a character lying in his own coffin with a glass window to see his face, and he's looking out of the window up towards the ceiling. It's an extraordinary moment and one of the best ever captured. At the heart of horror is knowledge. The knowledge that something awful is about to happen, but you don't know what or where, and a terrible feeling of ominousness, of dread, lurking like your fate has already been sealed and some sort of nightmare is going to come. That's the horror, not whatever comes at the end. Not when the vampire sinks its teeth into you, but the horrible knowledge over days and weeks that it's going to happen. There's an old saying that waiting on the edge of the battle is worse than the battle itself, and that's really something that could be said about this. The terror lurking, waiting for you is worse than the actual event. This is really a subtle psychological horror film about someone slowly dying and going crazy while he's doing it. It's a nightmare given form, and has prefigured countless movies, especially by Herzog and Lynch, some of my favorite directors. It's a magnificent movie and should be seen by everyone to follow a kind of waking dream that you're having, a sleepwalker going to his own grave. It's been released in a multi-disc series by the Criterion Collection, including the original screenplay and Carmilla by Sheridan LaFanu, and it's an incredible set. Highly recommended. You really should get this as quickly as you can if you're interested in horror. Nosferatu, another German film, of course, released in 1922. This is an unauthorized adaptation of the famous Bram Stoker novel Dracula. In fact, the author's wife sued the company because she said that they didn't have permission, which they didn't, to adapt the novel, and tried to get the film destroyed, which thankfully it wasn't. The movie is an absolutely amazing work, filmed with some of the most stunning examples of early cinematography. Once again, it creates a very strange, dreamlike attitude. In fact, it was remade in the late 70s by Werner Herzog, and he included this incredible movie, which he felt was so powerful even decades later, because of its dreamlike qualities. He thought that this movie really represented some kind of filmed nightmare. And the movie progresses beautifully, and I think amazingly without dialogue. We don't really need sound in this movie. It exists perfectly on its own without that. We just need the strange images, the odd flickering light. And this movie, like Caligari, was actually not a black and white film necessarily. It was filmed with a certain tinted color to it during various scenes, so you can have a yellow or a brown or a red there instead of the simple black and white gray shadows that we're used to. The movie follows, as you know, the story of Dracula, Count Orlok, who was trying to make his way to Germany and terrorize the inhabitants. The movie was brilliantly filmed involving rats and the plague, all the evil, nasty darkness that you'd expect to see in this ugly vampire's world. There's none of the seduction present in the later Dracula movies. He's not a sexy figure. This is an evil figure that is more in line with actual vampire lore before Bram Stoker modernized it. And Count Orlok, played by Max Schreck, looks amazing. His eyes are terrifying and expressive, and the whole movie is just a treat to watch. Nosferatu features some of the greatest moments ever captured in horror cinema, like when Nosferatu rises up from his crypt in this creepy vertical way, just subverting every reality that we have about life and death, and just comes straight at the camera like that when he's transporting the coffins around, when it just looks absolutely extraordinary, and he's just such a terrifying creature. I think that Orlok/Nosferatu has really gone on to linger in our collective subconscious as this evil, vile, monstrous creation that's lurking there deep in the eastern woods. There's a lot of political elements in some ways in Dracula about the barbarous East, about some sort of monstrous, almost subhuman life form far out in Eastern Europe that were part of the prejudices of Western and Central Europeans in the late 19th and early 20th centuries that had ghastly consequences later on in the century. And I think showing this guy as part of an evil, old-fashioned, almost medieval aristocracy, contrasting him with the more refined, bourgeois, Western and Central European is a really interesting counterpoint to look at. And the movie, it just looks incredible. There were a lot of different versions out there with different soundtracks, including industrial electronic soundtrack, various orchestral scores, all sorts of experimental music that they tried to play with it. All of them kind of work with it and kind of don't. It almost feels like something you can watch with the most minimal of ambiance in the background, with only very occasional music. It's an incredible visual experience compared to nowadays, where because of dialogue we have so much talking going on in movies. They don't really want to just sit back and use pictures to tell a story, and this beautifully shows how to tell a story with virtually no words at all. When they pop up on screen, you can probably safely ignore them and just figure out what's going on your own. It's still a classic almost a century after it was released. It is so fun to watch, and I think it is still pretty frightening after all these years. M by Fritz Lang. This is a magnificent film made by the director of the incredible masterpiece Metropolis, and this is one of his early sound movies. The movie is actually about a child murderer, and this was in 1931. In America, the concept of child death was really largely unexplored for a very long time, until the 70s and 80s. Really, it burst into the popular consciousness only with Freddy Krueger and Friday the 13th in the mid-1980s. So this movie was way, way ahead of its time in what it was talking about. The main character, the murderer, M, is played by the famous character actor Peter Lorre, who later went on to great fame in movies like The Maltese Falcon and Casablanca and a bunch of other horror and sort of crime roles. And he is absolutely amazing as this person. Over 70 years later, he is still creepy, unpleasant, and frightening, watching him in the opening scene taking away this young girl, dragging her off the streets. It's something that's so weird and so dark, and it's beautifully done because it's done without with just illusion. You know, we just see him looking at her. She's this completely innocent human being, and he takes her by the hand. We know what's going to happen. We know what he's going to do to her, and that's all we need. It's so hideous and frightening that it causes in your own mind to create the evil that's present there. Laurie's performance is magnificent and one of the best in horror cinema. The movie actually has him famously whistling the In the Hall of the Mountain King by Edvard Grieg, a famous piece of classical music. And I think that's really interesting because later on in the late 2000s, one of my favorite movie series from that era was the Red Riding trilogy, which also centered on child murderers running around, this time in northern England in the 1970s and early 80s. And at one point they actually play the King Crimson song in the court of the Crimson King. So I think there's this sort of legacy of showing the ghastly viciousness of these murderers attacking children. It's amazing this similar metaphor was used in both of those. I would like to see if the director of the first movie in the Red Riding trilogy was inspired by M in a way. The movie is based in some ways on a series of grisly serial killers and child murderers that were haunting the streets of Weimar Germany in the 1920s. Probably the newly uncensored press after the fall of the Kaiser allowed people to talk about these these evil, lurid things for the first time, and it sort of led to kind of an explosion of crime fiction during the era where people became fascinated. According to William L. Shearer, I think in his book, he said something about the decline of the rise and fall of the Third Reich, that people in Weimar Germany were kind of obsessed, seedy, almost prurient crime drama. And this movie follows a detective who is hunting this murderer. I mean, really remember, on American TV, it wasn't until, I think, 1998 or 9 that Law and Order Special Victims Unit first came out, where people began discussing these things more and more openly. And this was made in 1931, an early sound film. It's amazing. The movie is also very crucially a prototypical film noir, because it doesn't focus exclusively on the crime and the efforts to catch the criminal. It spends a heck of a long time showing the milieu, the métier that these people work within. The not necessarily evil, but the corrupt, seedy, venal world of the inner city and the criminal underworld that it inhabits. Because eventually, while the police are trying to track down this child killer, it's crucially the criminals and their own special network of bums, hobos, thieves, cripples, and just generally the lumpen proletariat at the bottom of society that eventually track down this murderer and actually hold a sort of kangaroo court where they try him for his crimes and try to accuse him of being this vile person. They want him dead because the police are cracking down on everyone in order to find the child killer. With issues that are still extant right now in 2018 that people are still trying to figure out. Is it okay to kill someone if they're pathologically driven by an inner madness to commit an evil act? Is it right to punish them in the way we do? Should we take their life if they have an illness that is causing them to do it? Or is that all a charade and they're just evil and violent and exult in being violent with others? What should we do? Should we kill them? Should we not? It's an amazing film that touches on so many different issues that are still relevant today, and it did it decades before anyone in America was even beginning to start working on these things. It's an absolute masterpiece that should be seen by anyone who has any interest in crime or horror, and it is still to this day terrifying to see this criminal working exclusively, it should be noted, through illusion. Unlike Freddy Krueger, we don't see him chopping up his victims. We all have to have that play out inside of our own minds with just the knowledge of what is going on and then a fade to black, and that is absolutely brilliant. See this movie. Haxan, or Witchcraft Throughout the Ages, a Danish silent film from 1922. This is a really interesting and probably the most unique work on this list, because how exactly do you classify it? A famous definition of documentary is the creative use of actuality. And that's really what Haxan is. It creatively uses things that really exist. The first 15 minutes of the movie are very similar to anything that you'd see on a television documentary on the History Channel or something nowadays. It just purports to give an early overview of the Mesopotamian origins of demons and witchcraft, which stretch back in the written record for 3,000 to 4,000 years, going all the way back to the ancient Sumerians and Babylonians. However, at this point, it then takes on a more fictional tone as it continues its somewhat documentary feel, explaining the origins of witchcraft, witch burnings, witch trials, the witch's Sabbath, and all of the things related to this sort of supernatural, sorcerous world that existed until relatively recently in modern times. And yet it uses fictionalized backgrounds to all of this, so we get to see actors portraying medieval peasants, inquisitors, clerics of various kinds, and of course witches and demons. And it takes you on a really interesting ride. The scenes with the witch's Sabbath are very well done. Makeup from this time period gets kind of derided, but I think it looks really good. I like the way that they've adapted medieval paintings of these ugly, grotesque, but also somewhat humorous and ridiculous Pan or Faunus-like demons, and shown them cavorting and capering, and all of them kissing the devil's backside, which supposedly witches had to do, which is an amusing sequence. It mixes horror and humor and ridiculousness and violence. altogether, because in that same scene, well, there's another sequence right after it where the devil is holding a butchered, boiled baby in his hands, with blood spraying down this disgusting infant corpse as he's dripping it over a cauldron and throwing it in there. It's absolutely hideous and dark, and you'd find difficulty showing that on film nowadays in 2018. In 1922, that was pretty darn extreme to see something like that on the screen. It purports to give a number of facts about witchcraft, but it uses the medium of film to sort of take you inside of this world, and it uses the then recent concept of close-ups, which were somewhat controversial in the use of this film at the time, to show the faces of people contorted in hysterical rage, supposedly dancing on the strings of the devil, or the equally contorted rage and violence of the inquisitors and religious people that are persecuting the witches, linking this hysteria and violence between the accuser, the accused, and the punisher all together, and showing them all to be somewhat demoniacal. There's so many amazing sequences in this movie, like when the witches are flying over the city, which instantly reminded me of the witch scenes in the 7th Harry Potter movie, where all of them are trying to escape over the city from Voldemort. It's a great moment. And I love this early special effects, with, the design of the devil covered in hair with his tongue lolling out like a dog or a wolf. Looks sort of frightening and amusing at the same time. I really enjoyed a genuine fright with the simulacrum of all of the torture devices, such as these things that they would twist around your neck, or this horrible thing where they would tie your feet together and drive with a sledgehammer, this wedge between them, causing horrible pain, which reminded me of the sequence in Misery, the film in 1990, where James Caan's legs are broken, where he's hobbled. It was an early precursor of that. The movie caused a lot of controversy back in the day for a variety of reasons. In Germany, they tried to include a condemnation of the senseless butchery of the First World War and link that to the violence of the witch hysteria, which caused a lot of patriotic comment from conservatives. In France, it was thought to be very anti-clerical, which indeed it is, and it was attacked on that level. It was attacked in the United States, oddly enough, for being a little bit too heavy on the information rather than the entertainment section of things. But this is a remarkable movie, which at the end, by the way, concludes by showing contrasting modern rationality and psychiatry, or then modern in the 1920s, with the horrors of the early modern era, where people were obsessed with witchcraft all around us. And it was, it's an amazing experience. This has been released on a Criterion Collection DVD with an amazing, informative commentary by an expert on the director Hans Christensen, and it also includes an interesting 1970s re-edit of the movie where it shows none other than beat poet William S. Burroughs doing the narration for it, which is very intriguing, and it sounds... It's quite an experience to watch that, and it's amazing to have that on the disc. This is an incredible film. The visual aspects of it are very interesting. The early makeup and the early special effects should interest anyone excited by those by early horror makeup and that kind of stuff. And it's got an interesting political edge to it, with the anti-religious attitudes and the pro-rational, pro-modern attitude of the director, and it's just an exciting experience showing a time period when the blending of documentary and fiction was still ongoing, and it's really worth checking out. I highly recommend this movie. So there you go. There were some movies from the early era of horror cinema that I think are still worth watching today. They're great films, and they prefigured a lot of what we see later on in the world of horror cinema and television. So please tell me what you think of these movies. Did any of these movies actually scare you, or do you appreciate them at least on some sort of at least technical or intellectual level? What do you think of these films, and what are some other movies from this era of horror, because I can only name a small sample of them, that you think should be on a list of the best early horror movies made in the first few decades of cinema? My name is Michael. Please like, comment, and subscribe if you enjoyed this video. I'm also going to leave a link to a few more videos of mine here at the end, so make sure to check them out if you enjoyed this video. So yeah, thank you very much, and enjoy Halloween.